cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom.
Thank you very much. And we are live. Good evening and welcome. This is a special webinar produced by Global Exchange and the Drug Policy Alliance and co-hosted by Law Enforcement Action Partnership and Students for a Sensitive Drug Policy. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, wherever you are. Please go to our website, globalexchange.org, to register and learn more how we are fighting injustice in the US and around the globe and what you can do to help us. Before we get started, please let me ask you to take a minute to share this webinar with your friends on social networks. Please, wherever you are, doesn't matter, share this Facebook Live on your wall so that many others can join this conversation. This webinar, it's being streamed on the Facebook walls of the Drug Policy Alliance, of the Enforcement Action Partnership, Global Exchange, and Rompeviento TV. Tonight, we're here to talk about decriminalization of drugs in the US. A very interesting topic. The U.S. war on drugs, which is a constellation of laws and policies that seeks to prevent the use of certain drugs, primarily through punishment and coercion, has been a catastrophic failure. Indeed, federal and state policies that are designed to be tough on people who use and sell illegal drugs have sent millions to jail and permanently branded millions of otherwise law-abiding civilians as criminals. These policies not only fail in their stated objectives of reducing drug-related death, disease, suffering, but they have exacerbated it. And they are at the root of human rights catastrophes in drug-producing and transiting countries in our hemisphere and all around the world. For example, on any given night in the US, there are at least 133,000 people behind bars, in prisons, in jails for drug possession. And 63,000 of them are held pre-trial. Hundreds of thousands of people also remain under some form of correctional supervision for drug possession. People convicted of drug possession faced a host of additional consequences, including, for example, the loss of federal financial aid, eviction from public housing, disqualification from a wide range of occupational licenses, loss of the right to vote, denial of public assistance, and of course, deportation. So let me ask something. Is drug criminalization a critical next step toward achieving a rational drug policy? Is it right now the time to try a different approach based in science and public health, rather than notions about the effectiveness of punishment and incarceration? That's what we're going to talk about tonight with our amazing group of panelists, which I want to welcome. Grey, welcome, good night. Grey is a staff attorney for the Drug Policy Alliance, focusing on criminal justice reform policy and litigation. Grey has a diverse background in criminal defense litigation, legislative analysis, and political advocacy. Grey has also served as a trial attorney at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, the Legal Aid Society in New York City, and in solo practice, and has also worked in legislative and political roles for several members of Congress. Thank you very much for joining us, Grey.
Thanks, Mark.
Grace Meng, Human Rights Watch. Grace Meng, it's a human rights researcher, advocate, writer, as a senior researcher of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch. She focuses primarily on the rights of immigrants in the United States, with a particular focus on the intersections of immigration and criminal law. She authored the June 2015 report on the impact of the war on drugs on immigrants in the US. We're going to post a link with this amazing report. You're going to see it in all the platforms wherever you're watching this A price too high, U.S. families torn apart by deportations for drug offenses. Grace, thank you very much for being with us. It's an honor to have you here. And finally, Lieutenant Diane Goldstein. Welcome, Diane. It's a 21-year veteran of the Redondo Beach Police Department in California. She's the board chair of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, a group of police, prosecutors, judges, and other criminal justice professionals who advance sensible criminal justice policy solutions that include making communities safer by focusing law enforcement resources on the greatest threats to public safety while promoting alternatives to arrest and incarceration, like the decriminalization of drug use and possession. Please go to lawenforcementactionpartnership.org to learn more about their work. So let's get started. Let's look first at the problem of criminalization, or in other words, what we call the drug war. So our first question, let's see. Let's begin with Grace. Please, Grace, your work is focused on human rights. How does drug criminalization impact the people who you work with and advocate for? Do you think there's a better way forward? Please take 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be as part of this webinar. I think the best way to answer that question is to share with you some real life stories of people Human Rights Watch has interviewed for our reports. Nicole Bishop was 29 years old when she spent 3 months in jail in Houston for heroin residue in an empty baggie and cocaine residue inside a plastic straw. Instead of being charged with misdemeanor paraphernalia, she was charged with felony drug possession. As a result, Nicole was separated from her 3 children, including her breastfeeding newborn. When the baby visited Nicole in jail, she could not hear her mother's voice or feel her touch because there was thick glass between them. She returned to her children later that year, but she was branded a felon and a drug offender. As a result, Nicole told us she would lose her student financial aid. She would have to give up pursuing her dream of a degree in business administration. She would have trouble finding a job, and she would no longer be able to have her name on the lease on the home she shared with her husband. She would no longer qualify for the food stamps that she used to help feed her children. She would end up punished for the rest of her life. Marion Schultz is another story of a woman whose drug possession convictions impacted the rest of her life. She's a lawful permanent resident from Germany who lived in the US for 50 years before being deported in 2014 because of 2 misdemeanor possession convictions for methamphetamine. Before ICE deported her, she was held in immigration detention for almost 2 years, longer than any time that she spent for the criminal offenses. After being released with an ankle monitor by ICE, she immediately entered a drug treatment program. She turned her life around. She was clean for 6 years. She repaired relationships with her US citizen family, including her son. None of that mattered. She was deported to Germany, and she ended up living in a shelter. She does not speak the language. She is living the consequences of these misdemeanor conviction possessions for the rest of her life. These are just 2 of tens of thousands of people who have been impacted by drug criminalization in the US. And as Marco pointed out, the racial disparities, the disparities on people who are poor is tremendous.
Thank you very much. You're right, Grace. Diane, please tell us, you spent your professional career in law enforcement at a time when the drug war orthodoxies went virtually unchallenged. What are the problems that you have seen with the criminalization model, and what has motivated you to advocate in a very effective way, I should say, for new and different policies?
Thank you very much for giving our organization this platform. As the voice of law enforcement and criminal justice professionals are so important to changing the system from within. I come to my advocacy work both from a personal and professional experience. From the professional experiences is I spent almost 21 years with a significant number of years working investigations, both gangs and as well as running a surveillance narcotics unit. And what I saw during my time is that we spent a tremendous amount of resources on what I came to view as a public health issue, even during my career. And it was drug war whack-a-mole. You know, every time, literally, I've done this conversation with so many different people, is every time we arrest 10 users, there's thousands more. Every time we arrest a low-level drug dealer, there's thousands. You know, we never get to that mid-level drug dealer. Getting kingpins is so rare, and the emphasis and the focus on supply side and not on public health treatments has actually increased violence, increased crime, increased death, disease, and addiction, and made our communities more unsafe. From the personal standpoint, I come to this advocacy because I wanted to turn the death of my brother, who had behavioral health issues, was dual diagnosed, and died from a drug overdose in 2007. And what I saw is the criminalization of his mental health issues actually contributed not to helping him, but impacted our family in such a fashion that I recognized that we have to do something different. And my goal was to try to help families not experience the same pain that ours did through this whole process. So I have both that personal and the professional. And as Grace said, you know, I dealt with a lot of families because I was heavily involved in community-based policing. And what the drug war taught me was people who are marginalized, who come from socioeconomic issues, who have lack of education, job training, lack of access to medical and behavioral health issues, is they suffer because we emphasize punitive policies rather than dealing with the criminal justice system and separating and investing in programs that are evidence-based, that are much more likely to reduce chronic substance use disorder and crime if we actually approach it from a public health treatment.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience, Diane. And Gray, please, you're a lawyer at the Drug Policy Alliance who has worked extensively with people caught up in the criminal justice system, as well as on Capitol Hill and other public policy circles. Can you please tell us exactly what decriminalization of drug use and possession would look like, and how it can redirect resources on true priorities, and why now it's the time to advance this agenda? Please take 4 minutes.
Yes, thanks, Marco. You know, as you said at the very beginning of this, and I think as Diane alluded to as well, the drug war has been one of the biggest policy failures in US history. You know, it's destroyed lives, it's divided people, it's destabilized communities, it's encouraged bad policing, it's escalated racial inequities, it's generated violence, and it's done all of this without achieving any real beneficial results. And I do want to say thanks again to Global Exchange. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Diane and Grace as well, for welcoming us to this conversation. You're all incredible advocates who have a lot of experience on these issues. My experience is more in the criminal justice system, particularly in the courts. I'm here on behalf of the Drug Policy Alliance, which for over 2 decades, as most of you know, has worked to end the drug war and promote drug policies that are grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. What this drug war has done over the years, over the past 50 years, is harm millions of individual lives. We all know the problem. It's stigmatized, it's made it harder for people to get health care and other services. It's made it harder, if not impossible, for millions of people really to fully engage in their communities, to work, to volunteer. And I think when we talk about this, a lot of times we don't actually talk about what I think we gloss over the fact of what it means just to arrest people in everyday cases. You know, arrests take people away from their regular lives. We detain people, we keep them from doing whatever it is what they were doing before, whether it's, you know, planning to go to school, planning to go to work or looking for work. And we, oftentimes police officers walk them out. There's stigmatization, there's shame. There's tremendous anxiety and anger that's results from all of this. There's so much more to an arrest, and it goes on for such a significant amount of time as people get dragged into the process. Grace talked about some of the more extreme examples of how this affects people's lives, but every day, if you walk into any courthouse around the country and just about any jurisdiction, and you walk into an arraignment courtroom, you're going to see a lot of people being charged with simple drug possession or possession of drug paraphernalia, low-level drug offenses that require them then to spend a lot of time in the criminal justice system, whether that's additional court appearances, whether it's diversion programs, community service, whatever the case, it has a very real impact on people's lives. That's very significant. As has been said, I think at the beginning, there were, in 2018, the most recent year on record, there were over 1.5 million drug-related arrests, 1.65 million drug-related arrests. 86% of those are for possession alone, and that subset continues to increase every year. This is the single largest offense that is charged in the U.S. And it doesn't affect supply. As Diane eloquently described, it hasn't interrupted supply and it hasn't reduced use. Even the DEA will admit that. Every year they put out a report and they say, the availability of heroin and methamphetamine and cocaine continue to be widely available and elevated, in fact. So back to your question, which is really just, what does it mean to decriminalize? What should we be doing? Well, there are a number of things that we should be doing to interrupt this, 50-year drug war failure. But first and foremost, we should just change the laws. We should decriminalize by changing criminal statutes to remove the threat of incarceration in the first place, to remove all the criminal sanctions that come with that. We should basically, when we do that, we should also incorporate things like changing the law retroactively. We should apply this to previous cases where people have been convicted. We should expunge records and do that automatically. And most immediately, we should get people out of jail who are sitting there, like you said, Marco, on drug possessory offenses. And we should do that immediately. What are some of the other aspects of decriminalization? Well, there are federal and state collateral sanctions for the use and possession, including the use of and possession of paraphernalia, like prohibitions on access to education and housing and public benefits and other administrative penalties that we should change. We should get rid of civil asset forfeiture, civil fines and license suspensions just for, especially in non-driving related cases, because it impedes people's ability to function productively in society. We should get rid of parental termination and child welfare investigations just because people have a drug-related arrest or conviction. But I want to get into some of the things that we can do in a shorter term. Some of the things that we can do short of changing the law as well. In the more intermediate stage, police-led actions, municipal-led efforts to divert people away from the criminal justice system instead of arresting people. And first of all, if at all possible, we should get police out of the equation. We should not have the police be the initial point of contact when somebody's in crisis or in need of services. We need to be sending people who are trained to deal with those situations, medical professionals, social workers, rather than police officers. But where police officers are involved, municipalities can and are setting up programs to divert those people directly to services instead of bringing people into the system. Prosecutors' offices are also doing some very forward-thinking work on some of these issues on drug decriminalization, including setting up projects and programs to, from a policy standpoint, say we're going to decline to prosecute certain types of possessory offenses, low-level offenses. Prosecutors are starting to realize that they serve the public and that their resources are not well served by continuing to do things the same way we've done for the past 50 years. So a lot of prosecutors are declining now to prosecute, or certain prosecutors around the country are declining to prosecute marijuana, for example, or drugs for medication-assisted treatment, Suboxone or buprenorphine, and paraphernalia such as syringes. They're also, in more progressive thinking jurisdictions, declining to prosecute all of these low-level possessory offenses. So there are things that we can and should be doing at all levels in the immediate term and the long term to decriminalize. I do want to get to the third part of your question, which is like, why now?
That's what I want to ask. Let me take a step back because for some people we might be going too fast. Let me ask you, Grace, please, why, if this is a mess, if this is a failure, let me just ask, but why do you think that moving towards decriminalization of drug use and possession can improve the climate for justice and human rights in the US? And why is this a priority for Human Rights Watch?
Sure. So Human Rights Watch has called for decriminalization of drug use and possession worldwide. And I just want to point out that this is not a fringe position among international organizations. There's a long list of organizations that have made the same call, including the World Health Organization, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. This is just not, the American Public Health Association. I mean, it's not a fringe position at all because so many people recognize what an epic failure the drug war has been. Human Rights Watch certainly sees the existing criminalization of drug use and possession as affecting core basic human rights. The right to be free from racial discrimination, the right to health, the fact that criminalization drives people underground when they could be seeking treatment, the right to family unity, the right to fair hearing for deportation for people who are non-citizens of the US. And then, the right to privacy. I mean, this is, what you do with your body is your business. And the government should only interfere with that right if they have a really legitimate purpose. And the way they do it, it should be proportional and necessary. And it should not be discriminatory. And the drug war utterly fails that test completely. We really see this, when we decided to make this call, we drew on our research around the world. We saw how armed groups in Colombia and Afghanistan have profited from the drug war and have committed really grave abuses. We saw how in the name of the drug war, the Mexican government has disappeared people, killed people, tortured people. We've seen how in Canada, the US, Russia, people are afraid to access necessary health services like clean needle programs. In India, Ukraine, and Senegal, we've seen cancer patients suffer needlessly because they can't access morphine because this fear of drugs is affecting even palliative care. And we've seen, quote unquote, drug rehabilitation centers in China, Vietnam, and Cambodia subject people to torture, to forced labor, to sexual abuse. I mean, in the name of eradicating drugs, which we all agree has not worked, drug use is still very prevalent. All these drug abuses have flowed out of that of criminalization. And so we really came to see that this was really key to addressing all of these abuses.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Grace. This is great. And we would love to hear if there are any other examples around the world that we can learn from. But let me just ask some questions from the panel. People are asking, let me welcome everybody's questions here on the Zoom platform or on the Facebook page at LEAP or at DPA. Marcos J. Hernandez asks us, so does Drug Policy Alliance endorses Andrew Yang because he wants to decriminalize opioids in the US and he has the most progressive platform on the war on drugs than any other Democratic candidates? You don't have to respond to that. Ray, because I know that that's a different issue, and obviously as in. But let me just tell Marcos, this is not only DPA. This is a conversation between a group of nonprofit organizations around this issue, which we are interested in starting the discussion more than endorsing, which probably as nonprofits we wouldn't ever do that. There's other people saying hi to us. Jason John says Portugal has had amazing success with decriminalization, with crime rate down. So maybe one of you wanted to talk more about this. And as I read the questions from soon, let me just go to Diane. Diane, we would love to hear your thoughts on what experience have you had both as a law officer and since that convinced you to do that decriminalization of drug use and possession will benefit our societies. And please also tell us how LEAP supports criminal justice solutions at our community center.
So I want to start because I think this conversation is so important because Grace mentioned that, internationally, decriminalization has been in play for countries, Portugal, Switzerland, heroin-assisted treatment programs, full decriminalization. But I think for our folks here in America, I want them to understand that our version of decriminalization is really kind of inaccurate. It's defelonization. What the United States has done as a whole is we've reduced penalties. We've defelonized possession, marijuana in some ways, but there's still some significant collateral consequences that result to people based on misdemeanor arrests and even sometimes infractions. As an example, you can get a ticket for possession of less than an ounce of marijuana, but if you don't pay the fine, they're going to issue a criminal warrant, you can still get arrested. So when we speak about decriminalization, it means the removal of any criminal penalty, incarceration, and like, as an example, in Portugal, they have some type of administrative fines that are no greater than, I think, 50 euros. And so what we've seen from the research across and outside of the United States is what programs based on public health treatments do is they reduce drug use, they reduce crime. Two notable examples is in Switzerland, who has not legalized drugs, and Portugal did not legalize drugs either. They're still illegal to sell or to commercially produce them, which is another issue that I think we need to have a conversation down the road on. But heroin-assisted treatment for those people that were not responding to methadone when they went to heroin-assisted treatment is it reduced welfare rates in Switzerland, it reduced death, it reduced overdose, and most importantly, for community health and safety, it reduced crime. I just again reviewed a report that came out in 1991 on methadone. People who successfully used methadone over a significant period of time reduce their criminal activity tremendously. And so we just received the 2020 ONDCP, the Office of Drug National Policy, put out their budget and their report. We have budgeted $34.6 billion towards a drug control budget that, yes, has language of harm reduction in it, but it may not actually be actualized. And so what LEAP does is what we're saying is rather than take that $34.6 billion, which a significant part of it is still invested on supply side and enforcement, why are we not using those funds on the front end to create resources, drug treatment on demand, Suboxone should be over the counter, naloxone should be in the hands of everybody, and actually implement overdose prevention sites, safe consumption rooms, support syringe exchange programs, because clearly harm reduction reduces death, disease, addiction, and violence. And take those monies that we're investing in law enforcement and place them into communities that have been damaged by the over-policing, by racial disparities, and creating reentry programs, job opportunities, education, expungement. There's so much we could be doing with that money, and instead we're wasting it on supply side that we know does not work.
Thank you very, very much, Diane. Before going to you, Gray, let me just ask again. Well, somebody says, amen, Diane, right on, says Gretchen. We have other questions. Says, is there a group of nonprofits that can help me expunge and arrest for possession? We're going to take your comment and your personal case, Miguel, to our panelists, and we'll get back to you. John says, you will align with decriminalize nature? Says we're trying to affect decriminalization of nature in Southeast Asia. We can talk more about that. With a celebration, a global potluck. Well, it's another commercial. We want to thank the almost 100 people that are watching us on Facebook Live and here on Zoom. Please bring up your questions and take advantage of the presence of this amazing panelist. We are live talking about it is time for the U.S. to decriminalize drug use and possession, and we're now talking with Grey Gardner. Please, Grey, turning to you again, in addition to the kinds of changes to our legal status that you've already spoke about that we need to take, what other kinds of changes in the ways we deal with drugs in our society could be beneficial? Or how do you think we can best gather allies and convince a majority of our fellow citizens that decriminalization is the right way to go?
Well, the best approach, as I think Diane and Grace have both mentioned, is to treat addiction and overdose as a health issue, and to actually implement harm reduction strategies that are beneficial in keeping people safe, rather than simply hindering them and driving them away from trying to get help. Things like drug checking, to make sure that there aren't any additives that are dangerous for people, safe consumption spaces to make sure that people are safe when using, honest drug education. Drug Policy Alliance has a very robust online set of principles for called Safety First that deals with an honest approach to educating students about drug use, and far more constructive than what's been presented in an abstinence way in the past. What we shouldn't do, for one thing, is go back to these same policies of the past. And that's what we've seen in part, with the response to fentanyl, for example. We've seen federal legislators in particular start to do the same thing, and in increasing penalties and exposure and exposing people to mandatory minimums, particularly people that are very low level couriers. Those are the people who've been charged most in the past. And it has a very disparate racial impact. So we shouldn't go back to these same failed policies over the past, we've used for the past 50 years in this failed drug war. As Diane was talking about, the costs of this are tremendous. What we've been doing for decades has increasingly created this, drug enforcement complex, this machine that eats up billions of dollars a year. I mean, it's estimated we spend $15 billion a year, at least in the US. The DEA budget is about $3 billion. We can and we should be shifting those resources toward more effective strategies for keeping people safe. When municipalities are prosecuting these types of cases, they're spending incredible amounts of money. I mean, some of the things that people don't really think of when they think of arrests and jail, they don't think of all the other things that go into prosecuting cases. They don't think about the forensics that have to be done to test things to prepare a case for court. They don't think about evidence bags. They don't think about, detention facility staff, government attorneys, defense attorneys, who are appointed even for possessory cases that just get arraigned and don't go to trial. All of that costs municipalities incredible sums of money, billions of dollars a year, and that could be channeled back into more productive ways. the other part of your question was, how do we engage people, more allies on these issues? And I think that in part is part of that, meeting people where they are on these issues. A lot of people come at this from different angles. It's not just, human rights. It's also people who are concerned about the use of taxpayer money. And those people should be engaged. We should bring them into the coalition as much as possible, and I think they are. Right now we have at least bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform, and we should embrace that and again try to present the information to people who are concerned more just about what they consider to be wasteful taxpayer spending or more libertarian principles. We should engage those people and try to bring them into this coalition and try and expand the coalition as much as possible in all of our conversations with people at the individual level and of course the organizations.
Thank you very much, Gray. So let me get back to you, Grace. We've heard some of our panelists, some of the people that are watching us asking us about Portugal. Do you know anything about that model, Grace, or are you familiar with other models around the world that might help us look into?
Yeah, I mean, I think Diane already pointed out, some of the key results of Portugal's decriminalization, and they did this in 2001. So we actually have, many years of data now. They actually saw the actual use of drugs go down. They saw definitely a decrease in overdose deaths. That they saw an decrease in, sorry, I want to make sure I get the numbers right. They saw the number of people receiving drug treatment jump by more than 60% after decriminalization. So if we care about people's health, if we actually care about people fighting any drug dependency, then this is a really key step to take. This is, I thought was really stark. In Portugal in 2001, there were 80 deaths from drug overdoses. In 2012, there were 16. So, it has it would have a real life impact.
Thank you very much, Grace. Diane, so please help us understanding what is it that we need to make this happen in the U.S. to take a step forward? What are the things that we need to overcome? What are the walls that we need to break? Who's resisting it? Why?
So, from a law enforcement background, I can say real clearly that we are making great strides relative to the work that LEAP is doing, both in the United States and internationally. But I think what's important is that we recognize some of the successes. So, for example, this last year is a Vancouver police inspector called for the safe supply of drugs. The Vancouver Business Association has called for a safe supply of drugs. Is you see law enforcement now starting to support overdose prevention sites, safe consumption sites. The conversation is very robust at the law enforcement level. And a lot of it has to do is because we're helping to work and design model alternatives to incarceration program. Now, some of the programs right now aren't perfect because they're still involved some type of coercion. It is pre-diversion programs are set up to try to get people out of the system. But what we're recognizing by supporting pre-diversion programs, it's actually changing law enforcement attitudes towards people who use drugs, people who suffer from substance use disorder, but things that pre-arrest diversion programs can do and can help us get to decriminalization very clearly is they reduce crime, they reduce drug use, they build better police-community relations, they reduce the burden on taxpayers by solving public health treatments, by getting people out of the criminal justice system. So this is, if I was queen of the world, I would decriminalize drugs and put all the money into public health treatment. But I recognize that we're not going to get there in that fashion. So we have to accept that there's going to be incremental steps that we can take. Law enforcement pre-booking diversion programs for drug users is a great start. And then we need to move towards things like the sensible regulation of marijuana policies so people don't get arrested and go to jail for things as simple as marijuana that is now, clearly within the next 10 years is going to be legal through the whole United States, in my opinion. But, programs like alternatives to arrest reduce racial disparities. It keeps families intact. It diverts money into resources that are much more cost efficient, much more cost effective, and puts law enforcement back into working and serving our constituents instead of just mindlessly policing them. And that's what the drug war has done. It's turned law enforcement into not serving our communities, not respecting our communities who demand something different in many aspects. And it has created these fiscal burdens that we really need to remove and place those monies into policies that actually are more beneficial for all our communities.
Thank you very much. We have a few amazing questions that I would like to read out to you, and please, whoever wants to respond, you can respond to one or to all of them. Marcela Tincher asked us, what suggestions would you have for a state like Texas without a ballot initiative in regards to starting safe consumption spaces, syringe exchange, harm reduction program? And Emily Jung asked us, wouldn't supporting safe injection facilities move the decrim conversation forward? And someone else asked us, why decriminalization rather than legalization? Doesn't that continue legal distribution and prevent monitoring of quality of substance? And finally, Dan tells us, I expect that most people listening to this webinar are well aware that the war on drugs is an epic policy failure. What are the specific steps that need to be taken? What would legislation, state and federal, look like? How do we build public support for this agenda? And then get legislators to vote for this. I think that this last question was probably already responded by some of you, but please take anyone and help us responding to our public.
Gray, do you want
Who
to take
wants
the
Sure.
legislative stuff? Well, so real quick, from a law enforcement perspective, because it's such a broad question, is some of the best successes that I've seen have been at the local and the state level. Is all of us here work in a collaborative fashion, attacking federal legislation, local and state. But coming from California law enforcement, what I've seen is, ballot initiatives are very helpful. If you're in a state where there isn't a ballot initiative, you're going to have to work in a collaborative fashion with other organizations in a legislative fashion. It may start as simple as, I believe Austin currently is going through a marijuana decriminalization that may be successful. Law enforcement is fighting back on it, but that's a step in the right direction. So, it's a complex discussion because it involves so many facets.
Thank you.
Marco, yeah, to follow on that, in terms of, first of all, decriminalization is the first step. We need to have all the options on the table, including legalization, where we can get there. But certainly decriminalization is where we need to be. We need to stop this machine from interrupting people's lives, from destroying lives. We need to stop that now and get law enforcement out of the business of trying to deal with addiction. Ballot measures where we can get them may be very helpful. They can also be very harmful in terms of taking us backwards. And we need to be very cognizant of that and try and prevent those types of efforts and continue talking about the progress that has been made over the years. Other intermediate steps that we could be taking, whether people like to talk about them or not, some localities are talking about just defelonizing for a first step, reducing from felonies to a misdemeanor or a misdemeanor to a civil sanction. But we do need to talk in a comprehensive way at the federal and the state and the municipal level about how can we chip away at these collateral consequences, not only the direct potential threat of incarceration and just criminal charges, but how can we chip away at the collateral consequences, the administrative sanctions, and come up with more constructive solutions to the types of problems that do arise. So there's a lot that can be done short of, especially in advocacy, that's short of just all out decriminalization and legalization.
Thank you very much, Gray. This conversation intends to be a 60-minute one that will very quickly and generally help us having a first introduction to this important topic. To all of our viewers, please consider sharing this conversation with others, with your friends, this conversation, this webinar. It's going to be available on globalexchange.org. It's going to be available on the walls of all these amazing organizations like law enforcement, DPA, and please share it with your friends on social media. Let's go to a final round. So I started by asking if now it's the moment to move forward, and I would like to reflect with you in this final round. Is now the moment? So we need to wait. Can we wait? And yeah, sure. Grace, please, if you want.
Hi. So, certainly we feel the urgency. I focus on the rights of immigrants and all these steps that have been taken, to defelonize, to reduce penalties, diversion programs. I mean, those are great, but they haven't necessarily helped non-citizens avoid deportation. I've met people who had, marijuana possession misdemeanors who literally spent a night in jail, maybe, if at all, and then found themselves years later, like over 10 years later, being arrested by ICE because immigration. I've seen people who had their convictions expunged getting arrested by ICE. And part of that is because of the way immigration law is really messed up and the way that it views convictions in a very unique way in its definition of a conviction. But part of it is that any sort of criminal sanction, any sort of, even like a plea that is later withdrawn, has these really devastating consequences. And, I know part of this webinar is looking at California. California is a very immigrant-rich state. So for me, it is incredibly urgent that we decriminalize. It won't necessarily stop, actually, I keep hearing cases of people who smoked marijuana legally in Colorado are now having immigration problems. So it won't necessarily change the federal law, but in terms of cutting down that pipeline, the flow from people getting arrested to deportation, it will certainly affect that.
Thank you very much. Grace or Diane, someone's asking us where is that Portugal data coming from and if it's available anywhere. So please.
The Portugal data that I cited is in our report every 25 seconds, which is the title of our report on drug possession arrests. This is focusing on the criminal legal system. That can also be found on our website.
Thank you very much, Grace. Please, Diane, your final comments. Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, go for it.
Marco, I was just going to say, if people want more information as well, they can go to the DPA website, and there's a fair amount of information there on Portugal and other issues. They can also check out the report that we've done on decriminalization as a whole called "It's Time for the U.S. to Decriminalize Use and Possession." And I would definitely direct people to go to drugpolicy.org to check out some of those resources.
Thank you, and Dr. Grace just put it up on the chat in this Zoom on the Zoom chat. Yes, Diane, please, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I just really want to emphasize that I think the reason decriminalization is so important now is simply the human capital that's lost in every arrest it's our family, it's our friends, it's our work associates. It's, you know, we in LEAP have long said is, yes, maybe, you know, chronic substance abuse is bad, but the drug war is so much more harmful. And until we change the law, and I think that's going to be the hardest thing for law enforcement to recognize, is that what we have to do and is simply change the law, get drug users, people who possess drugs, out of the hands of law enforcement and into community resources that I have continued to say, and it will continue to say, are so much more effective than criminalizing a public health issue. And it will free up law enforcement to devote their resources on violent crime, you know, in other areas where we should potentially have much more of a foothold.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diane. If anyone else would like to comment anything else, I don't know if Grey, you have a final comment?
I do just want to add that we do think now is the time. We think now is the time for a real acknowledgement that addiction is a health issue and it's not a criminal justice issue. We think now is the time because, as we talked about before, there is some degree of bipartisan consensus around this issue, at least that there should be some reforms, that we should be decriminalizing certain offenses or at least reducing penalties of certain offenses. And as Grace said, you know, there is an imperative for a lot of people whose lives are touched by this every single day, as Diane said as well. We need to get this done now, and we need to get this moving all over the country. So yes, it's also brought, you know, the opioid crisis, if you will, has also really elevated the discussion right now. So we're at a unique period of time where people are willing to talk about things other than criminalization as a solution. So within municipalities and states and at the federal level as well, you know, we can really drive this discussion a step further, and we should do so right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. This has been the first of, I hope, many conversations, because as we said, we've heard tonight the impacts and the terrible consequences of the so-called war on drugs. And definitely one of the things that come to my mind is how much we need to educate ourselves and educate others about these consequences. And we cannot stress enough the importance of having these conversations and trying to break all the myths and stereotypes around this topic and start to put at the center the life of millions of human beings in the United States and across the globe. So thank you very much to you all, Grey, Dr. Grace, Diane, thank you very much for being part of this, and hopefully it will be the first one. But please let me just ask you as panelists and everyone who's watching us to please, again, share this conversation, because this can be a powerful tool to educate millions of Americans and people around the globe on the impact and consequences on the war on drugs and the importance of decriminalization. Let's make it happen, and let's start by promoting this conversation, spreading it out. Miguel Pratt says, thank you very much, Human Rights Watch, DPA, and LEAP, for all you do for the community. I'm still being affected 49 years later for an arrest in 71. And great job, Marco. Thank you very much, all of you, and we'll catch up on the next one.